Hi everyone. For this video, I want to talk about something that's really basic to watercolor, which is the water itself. When I started out painting about 4 years ago, and I was learning about how to paint different shapes and paint different landscapes and things like that, one thing that I kept feeling a lack of confidence with was how much water to have on my brush. I had never taken any art classes. I didn't go to art school. I just taught myself on YouTube and Pinterest and Instagram. And what I really wanted was to take a class just once and have a professional look at my brush and tell me, is there enough water on here? Or do I need more? And am I using way too much, etc. That feeling went away after a couple years of practicing and just getting used to my brush and the water and the techniques itself. But I want to give you some of my tips on, are you using enough water on your brush? And unfortunately, the answer depends on what you're trying to do, which is the case for a lot of techniques with watercolor. It depends. So I'm going to show you on this paper some different levels of water and the effect that they can have and when you might want to use them. So I'm going to start with really, really wet brush. And that means I'm going into my water and really swishing it around, twirling it around. If I pick up my brush, it is just absolutely dripping. If I shake it, droplets of water come off. That is a really wet brush. And if I have it that wet and I go into a color, let's see, we'll do this Prussian blue down here. I would use a brush that wet to first animate my dry colors, meaning they're dry on the palette. I'm trying to get them to mix with the water, and so I can get a puddle of color so that I can be ready to paint with this color. Now, as I'm getting that color, if I still add water, I keep adding water, I get a really watery mixture, and I don't blot it off on my paper towel at all. If I just bring it straight to my paper, I have a really nice wet wash. And I might use that if I'm trying to fill in a large area of color, like a sky or water or something like that. If I keep going and add just way more water, it'll get so wet on the page that if I tipped it, it's all just gonna run down. I almost never use paint that's wet. That is that wet. It's hard to control. If you're trying to add in other color to bleed and blend, it'll all just become one big blob. If I try to add in this cobalt teal, I'm using tons and tons of water. It's all just gonna blob together. If I go back through and swirl around the brush, get it nice and wet, it is extremely wet. I mean, like, shake it, drops come off, and I just tap it against the paper towel. It's still full of moisture, but it's not dripping. Let's say I go into that mixture of Prussian blue. What you can do as you're painting an area is you can dab off your brush onto the paper towel. And if there's an area that you want to lighten or soak up some of that paint, this really great watercolor artist, Angela Fair, says that this is a thirsty brush. It acts like a sponge because it has less moisture than the paper. So when you put your brush onto the paper, it'll soak up. And if I turn this, tip this onto its side, it's not going anywhere. And I can still add in other colors and they'll blend, but they won't totally bleed in as one thing. I have a little bit more control I use that level of wetness on my brush a lot. You can use this heavier wetness just fine. Just know that you're not going to get as much control. It's actually really pretty, but I didn't plan that. So if you're looking for something that's a little looser, where you're just kind of exploring, that can be fun to use a lot of water, where it's literally dripping off the brush. I tend to go for this where I get it really wet and then I dab it off just a little bit on my paper towel. I will use that again for big sky area, big water area, where I'm trying to fill in with a large amount of color. If I'm trying to do something with more detail, like a tree or some shadow on mountains, I will try to use something that's a little bit less wet than this. So just kind of medium, because if I want to control the brush strokes, if I have something really, really wet and I'm trying to get really fine detail, that's about as thin as that brush can go. And even if I go to a smaller brush, say I go to this number 2 round, if I have it really, really wet, that's about as thin as I can go. If I dry it off just a little bit by dabbing it against my paper towel, I can get those thinner lines. That's what I'll use again for trees or for smaller detail, maybe line work in some buildings. It's helpful to just practice what happens when I try to do a thin brush stroke with a lot of water versus a thin brush stroke where I've dabbed it off against my paper towel. Observation is the key to watercolor. Just observe what happens. That kind of medium level of moisture I use a lot for last layers when I'm adding in the detail. And the driest I'll go is this dry brush technique. If I'm getting watercolor paint on my brush, that's a lot. I will dab it off almost entirely, have a pretty dry brush, hence it's called dry brush technique, and I'll just barely graze it over my paper. And because watercolor paper has texture, we call that tooth, especially cold pressed or rough paper, it's going to drag against that toothy texture and leave some white space. I have almost no moisture on my brush. This is sometimes hard to control because if you have just a little too much moisture on your brush, it will just fill in more than you might want it to. I really like using this for rock texture on mountains, and I really love using this for some ripply waves on water. I use that all the time for water. That's the driest I go. But notice, it's not that I'm getting a bunch of dry paint from the top. It's not really doing what I want it to do. I'm working with water. I'm dabbing it off, and I'm just dragging it across the paper, and that'll get you a really nice effect. This is a good one to practice just on an extra piece of paper. I just use the back sides of previous paintings that I'm not going to keep or frame. And just practice it, because you'll start to notice, oh, that's the exact right amount of water, or hey, I have a little too much moisture still. So those are the kind of 4 levels of water on the brush. Really, really wet and hard to control, but can do some interesting things. This is dabbing off my brush on the paper towel, getting a clear surface of paint and being able to add some things in and kind of control where they go. Dabbing off my brush several times to get those smaller lines of detail. And then really, really dry in order to get that texture using the tooth of the paper. So I hope you try these different techniques and just play around with it. This is not meant to come away with a finished painting. It's in order to know the water on your brush and on the paper, what that means, and how to use that to your benefit based on what effect you want. So I hope you give it a try, and we'll see you next time.